Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, May 25th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about the Tuesday primaries that occurred last evening and the results from Alabama, Arkansas, Minnesota, Georgia, and the state of Texas. There were runoff elections in Texas that occurred. The original primary was mid-March 2022. In Alabama, there are some races here that were regularly scheduled that we're going to be covering. Same thing in Arkansas, same thing in Georgia. But the interesting thing is that also we have a special election in Minnesota. This is not the regularly scheduled Minnesota primary. So we will be seeing some interesting results unfold from that first congressional district that's in a special election here. So looking at the states here, we really only have Alabama, Arkansas, and Georgia in terms of statewide major primaries. There were some more consequential ones in the House, in Texas, and in Minnesota, but generally speaking, most of our primary elections in terms of just the sheer amount came from the three states, Alabama, Arkansas, and Georgia. So we start off in Alabama. We're going to go in alphabetical order. So Alabama currently has a Senate race up and a governor's race, of course, all of their state legislative races and their House races. Now, the Senate race was quite interesting. Representative Mo Brooks came in second place. If you're wondering why I'm mentioning here, it actually is mentioned in the New York Times summary right here, that Donald Trump actually endorsed Representative Brooks back maybe even over a few months ago. But Donald Trump actually withdrew that endorsement. And the reason why he withdrew that endorsement, many people speculate, is because Mo Brooks was not doing well in opinion polling data. It was very clear that voters were opting for Katie Britt, who is the chief executive of the Alabama Business Council. And people seem to be happy with Katie Britt. They didn't really want Mo Brooks. He ran for Senate back in 2017, and voters rejected him even then. Roy Moore was, I believe, the pick for many Republicans back in 2017, not by a substantial amount, but it was evident that Mo Brooks was just simply not the favorite and certainly not the overwhelming favorite, and that became more evident this time around. So when Donald Trump issued a statement sort of withdrawing that endorsement, it looked very bad for Mo Brooks, and it looked a lot better for Katie Britt. In fact, if you take a look at Mo Brooks, he's a U.S. representative. His own congressional district backed Katie Britt by about 1 percentage point. So if he's not doing well in his hometown, he probably isn't going to do well in this runoff election. Couldn't even crack a third of the vote. Katie Britt more than likely has this locked down. As for the Democratic primary, nothing competitive there. And the governor's race, surprisingly, a somewhat competitive primary. Now, Kay Ivey has declared herself as the most conservative governor in the United States. So what we have found is that not everyone agrees. She gets 54.5% of the vote in the Republican primary, not because the 45% of the state, in the Republican side at least, doesn't think that she's conservative enough. Not that she is too conservative, but rather that she's not conservative enough. That's why she has really been trying to hone in on this message that she is the most conservative governor in the United States. The opponent here, Linda Blanchard, who got 19% of the vote, Tim James, who got 16% of the vote, these candidates here tried to appeal to the Trump masses in the state of Alabama. They tried to primary Kay Ivey, or at least force her into a runoff, and potentially get an endorsement from President Donald Trump. Donald Trump did not make an endorsement in the governor's race, though he did try to push another candidate into the governor's race, promising them an endorsement, and that is quite interesting. I believe I made a video about that a few months ago. But looking at the state of Alabama, what had happened here is that Kay Ivey has won her renomination and consequently re-election. On the Democratic side, there is a runoff, but realistically, this just simply isn't going blue. Moving outside the state of Alabama, outside of those races in Alabama, there isn't really much that we can look at in terms of competitiveness. Nothing is really that consequential in the state of Alabama at this point in time in terms of nationalized races, in terms of extremely competitive races. I could be proven wrong, but for right now, we're going to be working under the assumption that Alabama is still a solid red state as it was just under 2 years ago. As for the state of Arkansas, another solid red state, we are covering this one because Sarah Huckabee Sanders, her name might ring a bell, she ran for governor and just won the governorship essentially through the Republican primary. Again, nothing is said and done until the general election, but we have to be realistic when looking at this. Whoever wins the Republican primary statewide in Arkansas is more than likely going to be elected. Sarah Huckabee Sanders is recognizable for two reasons. Number one, her last name. Huckabee is a recognizable last name because Mike Huckabee ran for president, I believe, 3 times now. He was the former governor from the state of Arkansas. He ran in 2008, ran in 2012, ran in 2016, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders became Donald Trump's White House press secretary. She was the one who people talked about on SNL. She was the one that people mocked and mimicked and attacked, and also praised on the Republican side, and she is now running for governor. She defeated Doc Washburn by an astounding margin, getting 83% of the vote. She immediately got President Trump's endorsement, and that was a locked-up race. On the Democratic side, what we find is that Chris Jones won with 71% of the vote, with 95% plus reported. This race was also not consequential. As for the U.S. Senate race on the Republican side, John Boozman won. But an interesting thing here is that John Boozman only got 58% of the vote. It says here that there was an effort to overturn the 2020 election results that President Donald Trump sort of led and that many other Republicans followed through with. But John Boozman did not, that he refused to join the other Senate Republicans in this case. But President Trump still endorsed him in the primary. The interesting thing is that John Boozman faced opposition from two strong candidates, Jake Bequette and Jan Morgan. These candidates here were trying to sort of push another narrative that John Boozman was not conservative enough, that he was not pro-Trump enough to win this primary or to represent Arkansas in the United States Senate. As a result, John Boozman won, but with just 58% of the vote, which shows that there is still some discontent for some Republican incumbents for their unwillingness to back President Trump and the endeavors to overturn the election results from the 2020 presidential election. And you do see some pushback on these candidates, while not super substantial, are significant, especially for incumbents. On the Democratic side, Natalie James wins an outright primary there. Moving over to the state of Georgia, not Minnesota. I said we would go alphabetical order. Let's go ahead and do that. Georgia, we've covered this enough. I don't need to continue talking about it. If you haven't seen my full-on Georgia coverage, I would ask that you look at my most recent video today talking about the state of Georgia and how President Trump suffered many losses within this Georgia primary. We're going to speed run it. Let's go through it now. Brian Kemp defeats Trump-endorsed nominee or candidate, former Senator David Perdue, by 50 points. Polls indicated that Kemp was only going to win by maybe 20 to 30 points. Stacey Abrams wins an uncontested primary. Herschel Walker, the Trump-endorsed football player from the University of Georgia, running for Senate, got that nomination with 68% of the vote, an easy victory. On the Democratic side, Raphael Warnock, of course, running practically unopposed, getting 96% of the vote. And a huge upset, Brad Raffensperger, as the incumbent who had been attacked and vilified by the Republican Party, wins his bid with 52% of the vote to Jody Hice, a former U.S. representative, with 33%. So this is an interesting race. Brad Raffensperger ultimately wins despite many people expecting him not to. Attorney General Chris Carr defeats the Trump-endorsed John Gordon, a victory for the establishment Republicans, the incumbent Republicans, a victory for Chris Carr. On the Democratic side, Jen Jordan wins with a very similar amount. As for the House races here, Donald Trump's endorsed candidate Jake Evans gets second place in the 6th Congressional District, headed to a runoff election. In the 10th Congressional District, Vernon Jones, the Trump-endorsed candidate, getting second place in this primary, headed to a runoff. In the 7th Congressional District, on the Democratic side, Lucy McBath defeats the other incumbent, Carolyn Bordeaux. Their districts were combined together as a result of redistricting and an effort to shore up the Atlanta metro area votes that were turning on the Republicans' voters. In the 2nd House District, Jeremy Hunt and Chris West are headed to a runoff election on the Democratic side. In the 14th District, Marcus Flowers wins that House race, and in the 14th District Republican primary, Marjorie Taylor Greene easily soars to her re-election in the United States Congress. Now moving over to the state of Minnesota, we have an interesting race. So in the Minnesota 1st Congressional District Special Primary election results, what do we have? Well, there is a declared victor by the Associated Press. While a closer race, there were 35,000 votes, and in a margin of about 400 votes, Brad Finstad ends up winning this nomination. Now, this race opened up because the former representative had passed away, and the primary needed to occur, and there were nominations that were put forth, and candidates that were endorsed by different organizations. Jeremy Munson was the candidate who was endorsed by the Freedom Caucus. That is very much viewed as the pro-Trump wing of the United States House of Representatives. This victory for Brad Finstad doesn't necessarily come as too much of a surprise, but does come as a victory, again, as we talked about in Georgia, as a victory for more traditional, potentially speaking, because certainly not all, but potentially speaking, more moderate Republicans. When you take a look at the results here, the victory wasn't super consequential or substantial. The results here were a 1.2% victory. It was pretty close throughout the evening. No one knew exactly how it was going to go, but this was ultimately the result. And in the final state we are going to talk about today. So my screen recorder cut off, and I was talking about Texas for the past 5, 6, 7 minutes. So it cut off right then, and now I have to go ahead and fix this and stitch some things together. So we're actually going to go ahead and go through it again. So sorry for the abrupt cut. Hopefully that explains a little bit why that actually happened. But we're talking about the state of Texas. Let's go ahead and go through the primary runoff election results. We have races on the Attorney General's race, Lieutenant Governor, Railroad Commissioner, U.S. House, and state legislative races. We're not going to cover the state legislative races, but we will cover everything else that I had mentioned. So, to begin, Ken Paxton is the Trump-endorsed candidate. The interesting thing is that Ken Paxton wasn't actually able to win a significant outright majority in the first round, which is why he's in this runoff. George Bush was the candidate here who does carry the last name of, yes, George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, and the Bush family that is well known throughout the United States. George P. Bush was really vying for that Trump endorsement. He tried desperately to get the endorsement, even pushed back on his own family in a very public manner. In an huge effort and very clear effort to appease President Donald Trump to get that endorsement at some point in time. Well, Donald Trump never got him the endorsement and instead endorsed Ken Paxton in this race, and Ken Paxton ended up winning with 68% of the vote. Now, that also isn't super surprising because he is the incumbent, probably should have been winning an outright majority in the first runoff election, in the first prior to the runoff election, but it is interesting because Ken Paxton was this candidate where faced up against George P. Bush, could have lost because he wasn't able to do well in the first time around, but absolutely decimated his opponent this time, really ending the Bush legacy in the state of Texas and across the United States. On the Democratic side, Rochelle Garza defeats Joe Jaworski in this race, resulting in this victory for Rochelle Garza. Lieutenant Governor's race, Mike Collier ends up winning with 55% of the vote. Michelle Beckley at 45% of the vote, a 10-point margin. Different regions of the state seem to support different parts of these candidates, at least on the Democratic side. You take a look at the southern border and you find a lot more purple than you find blue. You take a look at other regions of the state, you find a lot more blue, or sometimes you find them, dispersed in and out depending on where you are. You look around here, okay, it's dispersed. You look around here, it's a lot more blue than purple, but you look down here, a lot more purple than you see blue. Closer race, definitely something to take a look at, definitely something to explore in future videos and future on your own. In the future on your own, but looking at the Lieutenant Governor's race, there is a clear victor, and it is a 10-point margin. Really isn't that close when it comes down to it. The Railroad Commissioner race, not super consequential. The incumbent wins with 65% of the vote, not super significant. And in the House race here, the Republicans already have a call, but unfortunately, the Democrats do not. It is about a 100-vote margin between the two candidates here. The current second-place candidate is Jessica Cisneros. She is at 49.8% of the vote. And Henry Cuellar, who is at 50.2% of the vote. He is the incumbent in this race. He is the incumbent who has been here for 10 years now. This is a race where the Democratic Party has endorsed opposing sides. You have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with Cisneros on one side, with Bernie Sanders, with a different type of Democratic coalition, a progressive type of Democratic coalition. On Cuellar's side, you have Steny Hoyer, my representative, Nancy Pelosi, House Speaker of the House, and also Jim Clyburn, the House Majority Whip. You have the top three Democratic members, ranking Democratic members at least, in the House of Representatives endorsing Henry Cuellar, the last pro-life Democrat in the House of Representatives, against Jessica Cisneros, who is now viewed as this progressive champion, someone who is rising up, doing well in the state of Texas. Unfortunately for her, it does not look like she's going to win. Now, I want to make another video talking about it, but I'm going to wait for the finalized election results to come out. Unfortunately, the margin is just way too close for me to make a solidified prediction. I do think Cuellar will ultimately end up edging this one out. Looking at the margin here, it doesn't look as if, based off what we've heard from the Texas Secretary of State and also the counties in this district, that there will be more votes coming out from the 28th district. However, things can change. A recount might happen because it is within a 0.5%, and it might come to a position where we will still be litigating this election for quite some time. So definitely stay tuned. We'll talk about it a little bit more in depth. Hopefully there's a prediction sometime, or hopefully there's a projection from the Associated Press sometime in the future. I'm quite doubtful, though, looking at this margin, because you never want to be super confident about someone, because people don't want to be wrong, and certainly associations that are highly well respected don't want to be wrong as well. But this is the standard centrist Democrat, not even centrist, conservative Democrat versus progressive Democrat type of scenario that we've been seeing popping up across the United States, and in most cases now, surprisingly enough, based off of previous primary performances from 2020 and 2018, despite a few, outliers such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Cori Bush, in this race, you are finding that the more conservative Democrat is doing well. And they're doing well by winning over minority voters that otherwise might be expected to be more progressive and might have been underestimated within this district. Jessica Cisneros has now lost 3 times now. She lost in 2020 when she tried to primary him by a margin of 2 points. She lost in the first round by a margin of 2 points, and now she's going to lose by 100 votes. I wouldn't be surprised if she decided to run again in 2024, but looking at these 3 losses within the primary, there is something to be raised here about, hey, maybe a different progressive voice should be running. Now, Cisneros, looking at her from a politician's standpoint, I think she definitely has ideas that could work in other regions in the state of Texas, in other districts. I just don't think this is the right one. Looking at the fact also, I do think Henry Cuellar is the more electable candidate when it comes down to 2022. Looking at his victory in 2020, in a district that was less Democratic than it is now, he won by 20 when Biden won by 4. Largely, Biden did poorly in this district because he has been labeled as a socialist. He has been labeled as this communist of sorts. And I think that's something that really resonated when you saw a significant portion of this more southern region, at least, when you're talking about the Mexico-American border, where you are looking at voters here that backed Hillary Clinton to a very large extent that were unwilling to back Biden. And the messaging here that was employed by the Republican Party was that Biden was a socialist. Playing into the fears of voters in this region worked positively for the GOP. But Henry Cuellar really didn't move much. He won by, again, 20 percentage points in this district. It was very impressive, and it was a very overwhelming result when Biden was barely able to scrape by in this congressional district. So maybe in this general election, Democrats will actually benefit by having Henry Cuellar in this congressional race. But should he lose, at the end of the day, the Democrats nominated someone who, in a sense, doesn't stand with the rest of the party on a lot of mainstream issues. But again, I'm not one to judge a congressional district or its voters for how they voted. I'm here more to analyze what had happened and also just explain a little bit further as to how one candidate can do better than the other and why one might be more electable, even if they don't exactly take the positions that align with the standard Democratic Party, which is also a reason why it might make them more electable later down the line. So that's pretty much it in terms of the primaries that we have seen thus far. I will update you guys as more projections come in, especially in that 28th congressional district that we just spent about 5 minutes talking about. A lot of interesting numbers here, a lot of interesting results, a lot of tests and trials for progressives and centrists across the United States. And we will see what happens by the end of this primary season and what that means for the future of both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.